One of the great examples is Matthew 18:20, which I think I have on the screen. For where two or three are gathered in my name, there am I among them. How many of you have heard that before? Raise them up high if you've heard that before. Okay, so almost everybody. Where do you often hear that? Where have you most often heard that quoted? Okay, in church, small groups, where else? In prayer meetings, yeah, and I would say maybe the number one in my experience is hospital rooms as someone who does chaplaincy. I've either heard this or been at times the person to quote it in the past, in the presence of family and friends who are grieving or fearful or just anxious about things that are happening in a hospital. And you remind them, as we are gathered here with this person, Jesus is with us. And that is good, and I think it's true, but it's not true because of this verse. So let's assume that means what you think it means, that whenever two or three people gather as Christians, that's when Jesus is present. If that's really what God meant by that, so when you have prayer meetings, small groups, church services, that's when Jesus shows up, then think about the inverse, and this is why it troubles me to misquote God. What if only one person is there? What if you're alone? What if you're in a predicament and you're the only Christian present? Wouldn't it be sad because Jesus can't be there? Because there's not two or three gathered in his name. And nobody ever stops to think of that. Or maybe you have. Maybe you have thought about that before. Maybe you've even wondered, maybe I need more Christians around so that Jesus can show up. But that's not what it means. I'll remind you, that's not what it means. The good news is that the reality is better than this quote would have you believe. God is always ever present. That's one of the main character traits of God that all Christians agree on, is the omnipresence of God, that God is always present. God can be always present because God is spirit. God doesn't have a human body. God isn't bound by space or time. God is everywhere at all times. God is a spirit. Some would argue God can't be present everywhere because sin is in the world. God can't be present where there's sin. But have you read the Gospels? Then you know God went right into the places of sin. He put on a human body and he walked among sinners. He touched sinners. Sinners touched him and they were healed. He didn't suddenly die because he was in the presence of sinners. God cannot die and God cannot sin. But God can be in the presence of sinners. Even in the Old Testament, some of you think, well, that was Jesus, that's different. But even in the Old Testament, the prophets remind Israel over and over again, God is with you wherever you go. God will not leave you nor forsake you. You shouldn't be dismayed or fearful. God is with you always. You are God's people. God is ever present. So I'll encourage you at the beginning that that's not really what this verse means, and God is with you even when you're alone. But then you have to ask, what does it mean? The actual context of this verse is found in the verses surrounding it. So now we're going to look at verses 15 through 20. And the context here is handling conflict among Christians. So Matthew 18, 15 to 20. And anytime I read brother, just know it can mean sister. It's just fellow Christians. So anytime a fellow Christian sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of two or three witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. That means don't eat with him anymore. Don't spend quality time with him anymore. You could still show him kindness. You can still be friendly, but he's not part of us any longer. He's removed himself. Verse 18, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, there am I among them. So it has nothing to do with prayer meetings or hospital calls. It isn't about worship services. It's about handling conflict. That verse is an encouragement for those who have to deal with crappy situations between believers, which is good that God gives us that help. If love and unity are the goals of Christian behavior, then conflict is the antithesis of Christianity. Conflict is the antithesis of Christianity. Enmity between God and human beings. Enmity between humans and other humans. That is the end result of sin. It is destructive. It's deadly. And many things can introduce conflict or even awkwardness into relationships. Disagreements, words spoken, actions taken, secondhand conversations that come back to us. In fact, that's often where conflict between Christians comes from, is the secondhand stuff you hear, and then you start to form those opinions. It could cause us to back away from a relationship, to suspect that others don't have our best interests in mind. We create an invisible wall between ourselves and someone else. It happens in families, among friends, in the workplace, anywhere that we have key relationships, even and perhaps most painfully among Christians. It happens. Conflict in relationship. Any of you ever experienced conflict in your relationships? Come on now. You don't need to be embarrassed. Everyone else is saying it. Yeah. Conflict, in a weird way, conflict is sin, or it at least breeds sin, because sin by nature is destructive, and conflict is destructive if not dealt with. Conflict can be constructive if we follow God's pattern, but if we don't, it leads to sin and destruction. Sin. Mike Rowe, who politely handed me that beautiful piece of paper earlier as a gift, also asked me this week, you know, something, Joe, I'd like to hear you preach on sometime is sin. And I said, is there something on your mind, Mike? No, I didn't say that. He's a sweet guy. He's a much nicer human than I am. But he did say, it's just one of those things. You know, you talk often of the love of God, but I wonder, what do you have to say about sin? Of course, we struggle with it. People continue to sin. Doesn't God say something about that? And I said, well, of course God says something about that. And he said, well, then whatever happened to talking about sin? Whatever happened to sin? That stuck with me. That was in the middle of this week, and I've since then reframed some of this sermon based on that question. Because I don't really know. I don't really know whatever happened to sin. It's still there, isn't it? It's definitely still there. So what happens to sin? Where do you go with sin? So I thought about it a lot. Why don't I talk more about sin from the pulpit? And I think it's because I'm not a good gardener. That makes sense, right? You want me to connect the dots there for you? This is my new favorite analogy I've ever presented from up here. So I hope you get it. I don't pull weeds. I just don't. You drive by 11 Vine Street, you'll see what I mean. It's crabgrass galore, weeds everywhere. It's terrible. I mean, it is terrible. It's one of my greatest insecurities. And if I'm being really honest with you, I worry sometimes what your opinions are of me based on my house. The outside. But the inside, we keep very clean and tidy as much as possible with 3 kids. But I am a germaphobe, but I just don't care about my lawn and plants. I never have. I don't think I ever will. I love seeing other people's beautiful lawns. It's just not for me. I just don't care. So thank you. But I do live in town, and there are expectations to be met. And so I meet the bare minimum whenever I'm required to with, angry texts from neighbors or things. I'm just kidding. My neighbors are very nice. But they're also really good at gardening because they pull weeds. One of my neighbors, she's out there every day in the springtime and in the early summer pulling weeds. Every day. And I think, what dedication. If only I cared that much about anything in my life, let alone pulling weeds. I don't know why I don't pull weeds. I thought this is why it's a good analogy, because it's probably the same reason that I don't want to address sin, because of laziness, perhaps. I don't want to have to do it. It's not fun. I don't find it therapeutic or cathartic in any way. I find it to be a nuisance, and then I have to wash dirt from under my fingernails. It's just not fun. I don't like it. I'm also allergic to a lot of stuff, so then I end up getting hives and annoyed by allergies. And it takes forever, and I have so many other things I'd rather be doing. So it is laziness. It's also indifference, because deep down, way deep down in there, I just don't care. I really don't care what my yard looks like. It's only to impress other people, and I'm learning more and more that I don't care what they think. So no offense, but it's just part of growing up, I think, becoming cynical. And so it's indifference, perhaps, and I think I think it's overconfidence in my plants. I have hostas and ferns, and then mums for like a month till they shrivel up every fall, but those are just for Kylie. I would never buy those. But ferns and hostas, right? And as a kid, my mom had lamb's ear, which also is like, the things that are impossible to kill. So in my brain, I'll just have a few green plants that they will do fine without me. And so I have this overconfidence that my grass and my plants, it'll all be okay. I just, mow every couple weeks when I feel like I really have to. So this is cathartic, talking to you about all this. I'm feeling better. And also some of you are thinking, I've noticed he has a terrible yard. But you can't say that to your pastor. It's rude. Well, now you know how insecure I am about it. So please don't say it. We know it's how it works. That's why my neighbor's yard, talk about keeping up with the Joneses, keep up with the Evanses. My good Lord. The gorgeous plants, all this tropical stuff all over. It is so pretty. And I could never, so I don't. I just don't. But I see her out there pulling weeds, and I think, I should probably do that. I know I have to do it. If I want to have something beautiful, I'll have to pull weeds. I will have to overcome the laziness, the indifference, the overconfidence. I'll have to move forward and do the dirty work. But it's hard. It's hard. I think that's what becomes of sin. It's just hard to deal with. But we know it has to happen. Someone has to pull the weeds. It has to be uprooted in order for the healthy stuff to thrive. That's the point of discipline in Scripture. Like the stuff that I just read, this process of discipline in the church and calling people to account and just any kind of accountability in life is dirty work. It's not fun. It's not enjoyable, but the goal is restoration. It leads to something good. It is constructive work. Like anything worthwhile, it takes effort and sacrifice to reach the end. And sometimes the effort and the sacrifice is just too much for me to want to jump into it. But I know it has to happen. Just like pulling weeds has to happen if you want to have truly healthy plants and grass and everything else. Or even just a garden, a beautiful garden. You're going to have to do the work. Now, some people, this is the other reason I don't do it. Part of it's my own personal struggle. Part of it's reactionary because some people, especially some preachers, they come in with these god-awful chemicals and they douse everything. And you know what? It works. All those pesky weeds just shrivel up and die. And so does everything else. Even the good stuff, even the pretty stuff. But at least we got those weeds. And I've seen so much of that in my mind it's like, what are a few weeds going to hurt if I still get to have something beautiful next to it? And so I sort of excuse the work because I've seen the other extreme that is so careless and reckless. But at least they get the weeds. What do you think of the analogy so far? Yeah, thank you. Truly, it's probably the most clever I've ever felt in the pulpit. And I didn't steal it from another preacher, but I did kind of steal it from Jesus Christ. So that's cheating. So how do we do this? How do we hold one another accountable to keep pulling weeds in our spiritual gardens? And I do mean our gardens, not other people's gardens. Jesus is also careful to say that. This isn't about the rest of the world. This is just for believers, and even still for believers who have that kind of trust with one another. You can't just go around and yank weeds out of other people's gardens. It doesn't work that way. In fact, I know a lot of people who think weeds are beautiful and should be left alone. Those aren't the people I'm going to try to help. And that's a pretty profound metaphor. That's not who we're talking about. We're talking about those who agree that the weeds ought not to be there, that they are going to choke out something more beautiful or more purposeful. For those people, we're called to exemplify the love of God, and love does not allow someone to hurt others or to hurt themselves. Love requires that we take action at times, even preventative action. Sin hurts people. So love requires that we fight against sin in our own lives and in the lives of those we love, our fellow believers. To do that, we have to practice discipline. We have to pull weeds or help people pull weeds. And the order laid out in Scripture almost feels sterile. When I read those verses, it's just do this, then do this, then do this. And hopefully one of those will work. Otherwise, you got to move on. But these are people, right? These are real human people we're talking about. These aren't just weeds in a garden. These are real humans. And it's never so simple. And frankly, it's more important. We're not just speaking metaphorically. We're speaking about real people's lives. This is serious stuff. So we have to practice discipline. What does the Bible say? Well, Matthew 18, what we just read, explains in the event of conflict involving obvious sin, the steps we should take. First, you address it one-on-one with the individual. Then, if it's still unresolved, you take that to a small group of trusted friends. And in that small gathering, you try to deal with it with evidence and witnesses. And you say, look, we've all seen this. It's a real problem. We're here to help. Let us help you. And if they are still obstinate and unrepentant, then, God forbid, you would have to take it to the whole church. And there are different opinions of how long these things take. Most people I know and most denominational teachings on it, it's months of the small group discussion before it ever goes to the whole church. And a lot of churches aren't this big, so it's not that big of a deal. But here, that would be pretty significant if we had to address someone's sin in front of the whole congregation. That'd be a pretty painful process. And all of that, again, feels almost sterile and inhuman. But it's not. It's perhaps the most human thing you can do because you are showing concern for a person, concern enough to put yourself in this conflict to help them solve their conflict. You care enough to put yourself in a difficult situation in order to help another person. That's very, very similar to what Jesus does for us. That is what Jesus does. Whatever we do, notice that the privacy of the individual in sin and the benefit of the doubt are automatically given to that person. Privacy and the benefit of the doubt. We start one-on-one, then we bring in a couple of people that are trusted, and then eventually we might have to bring in the whole church if it gets that bad. But you always assume innocence, you assume the benefit of the doubt. You say, let's talk first, just let me see if I had a misunderstanding here. Okay, it seems like no, there's no misunderstanding, there's a problem, and you're not agreeing with me, so let me bring other people, and let's make sure I'm not wrong about this. And then even if that doesn't work, then we'll have to involve the whole church. But there's grace throughout those steps. There's a building process. You don't just say, I'm mad at this person, I'm going to humiliate them in front of the whole congregation. That would be more destructive than the person's individual sin. This is humble, patient, gracious work dealing with sin in the church. You don't beat people up with guilt. I've seen some people, their Bibles must weigh 300 pounds, and they slam them at people. That's not what we're called to do. Now, there's another passage where this is addressed, and that's in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 17. Verses 3 and 4, Jesus says, pay attention to yourselves. If your brother sins, rebuke him. If he repents, forgive him. And then this is the part his friends did not like. If he sins against you 7 times in the day and turns to you again 7 times, saying, I repent, you must forgive him. So Jesus says, if someone keeps sinning against you, but they keep repenting, you have to keep forgiving. Now that's very gracious conflict management. He doesn't say 3 strikes, you're out. He doesn't say 7 strikes, you're out. He says 7 and you keep going. An essential part of conflict resolution is forgiveness. It's grace. Because the end goal is always restoration and healing. The goal of conflict resolution is healing and wholeness. That's the goal of everything in God's economy. God isn't interested in destroying people or tearing them down or making them feel guilty. God's concern is healing people, helping them, growing them, strengthening them. Because that's the goal, the process takes a lot of time and often involves repeated failures. Repeated failures. Repeated failures. Repeated failures. I underlined that thinking that would be funny if I did that. Once again, it wasn't. You don't even have to laugh at me. You didn't laugh with me, and only Rob laughed at me. So this is just a rough one. Maybe it's because I'm talking about sin. Maybe this is why I don't talk about sin, because then you don't laugh at my jokes. Now, I'm struggling to say the next part because of how many people pop into my head. I mentioned repeated failures because one of the hardest things to do as a Christian is to allow people you love to hit rock bottom. And having done that with quite a few people in my life, it's hard. It's really hard. So God tells us not to do it alone. Don't go through that process alone. Don't let them go through it alone. Bring 2 or 3 people with you. Make sure that you surround this person with love and support and accountability and concern, healthy Christian concern. Then sin can be dealt with, but only when they're surrounded with that loving community, that small group of people. And so Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am, right there among them. That's the context. I think Jesus is always with you when you pray in the hospital, when you go to a small group Bible study, when you gather for worship. God is with you. But you know when I really want to know Jesus is right there is when I have to deal with some ugly conflict with someone I love. In that difficult, awkward moment, that's when I need to know Jesus is there. I sort of assume he's here when we're singing to him, but where is he when I'm telling a friend some really difficult thing I need to tell them? He says, I'm there. I'm right there with you. We have to be serious about sin, but we have to be just as serious about helping sinners to recover, to be healed. That's why we pull weeds, because we value the garden. I don't always, and that's why I'm not always talking about pulling weeds. But I should do it more. And I would guess you are the same way. I don't mean your yards. I'm sure they're all much nicer than mine. I mean your spiritual lives. Another clear meaning behind this verse that I think the misquoting often leaves out is the power of mediation. When you think just 2 or 3 people are gathered, now God's here, all you think about is a group. You just think of a bigger number. But the point of the 2 or 3 is that you have mediators. The idea behind this is now it's not just me and you, but it's me and you plus a mediator or 2. People to help us communicate and get through this together. Mediation is so important in the Bible, and we often gloss right over it. Now, I especially value mediation because that's a big part of my role as a pastor. I mediate for people. I'm not a licensed counselor, but I often counsel people as a mediator. I help them communicate, whether that's married couples or friends or parents and children or even individuals trying to hear themselves and understand and listen well to their own inner voice. That sounded kind of new agey, but you know what I mean. There's sometimes we just have internal conflict and we need to talk to somebody. That's the role of a mediator. It's to help communication develop so that conflict becomes resolved. Mediation is so important. We learn it from Jesus. 1 Timothy 2, 5 and 6. There is one God and there is one mediator between God and humanity. The human Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all. That's right there in black and white. Jesus is the mediator between God and humankind. Jesus, who is God, became human so that he could bridge the gap, so he could mediate for us. That's how important mediation is in the kingdom of God. Now, I know many of you didn't raise your hands, so you apparently don't have conflict in your lives. But I found examples in the Bible to help you. The first one is negative, the second one is positive, and I want to point out the difference. The first one is Cain and Abel. How do you think that conflict was handled? Good or bad? Yeah, it's bad, right? Not well. Not well. How did the story of Cain and Abel end? Murder. Yeah, every time I hear that, I think of Dwight Schrute saying, it's not called muck duck. R is an angry letter. Murder. There's a weird TV reference, sorry. It's hard to have ADHD and talk for 40 minutes, okay? Let me look at my notes again. There's no mediator. Thank you, I love you too. There's no mediator. Cain and Abel take their problems right to the point of death. Cain kills his own brother, Abel. He becomes jealous, he's envious, he's angry, and in his spite, he kills him. He never goes and asks for help. He never seems to say, maybe someone else could enlighten me. Maybe I'm misunderstanding the situation. Maybe our disagreement needs someone to help mediate. He just goes right to his brother and kills him. There's no patient one-on-one discussion, and there's certainly no 2 or 3 witnesses like bringing in mom and dad and having a more mediated discussion. Why did God favor him and not me? And he could have talked about how much that hurt him. Maybe Abel would have repented of the pain he caused his brother and said, that was unintentional. I never meant to make you feel that way. You know, we're brothers. I care about you. Who knows what could have happened if they had followed the steps, if they had had a mediator. But they didn't, and it ended in bloodshed and death. And that's enough about that story, because I think we all know that one. Here's a better example. I was going to say David and Bathsheba, but it's really, I guess it is David and Bathsheba, but it involves other people too, like Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba. How many of you know that story? Anybody familiar with that? Okay. So King David in Israel decides while he's home from war, when all the other kings go out to war, he stayed home. He's up high in his palace. He can look down on everybody beneath him, and he sees a beautiful woman bathing. He asks, who is she? They say, oh, she's married to one of your soldiers that, is very faithful to you. That's his wife. And he says, oh, okay, good. I don't care. Bring her here so I can have my way with her. So he has her brought to the palace. He has his way with her. She becomes pregnant with his child. Then he decides he has to cover this up somehow. So he has her husband brought in, and long story short, he wants to convince him that he got her pregnant, but he refuses to go home, the soldier, because he loves the king, and his loyalty is so strong that he says, how could I go home and sleep with my wife and have a nice evening at home and relax when my buddies are out there dying in the fields for their country? I could never do such a thing. I'll sleep here on the steps of the palace and keep watch. And so David, apparently having no conscience at all, says, okay, this guy needs to die. So he sends him to the front lines of battle, then has the other troops pulled back, and Uriah is killed in the front lines. They come back and tell David, Uriah the Hittite is dead. Your plan worked. Plan A didn't work, but plan B worked. And David says, okay, good. Now I'm in the clear. He brings Bathsheba to his palace, pretends nothing ever happened. He's the king, after all, who's going to call him to task, and problem solved. Except one morning, he's invited by the prophet Nathan to come down and have a chat. And David goes to Nathan, and Nathan says, David, I need to tell you a story. I need your help. There was once a man who had hundreds of lambs, just hills covered in lambs. And then there was this other guy who lived down the road. He had one little lamb that he nursed when the mother died, and he bottle fed this lamb, and he's raised it. And it's precious to him. It sleeps in the house with his kids. He loves this little lamb. And the time came for a sacrifice to be made. And the wealthy man decided, rather than taking one of his hundreds of lambs, he was going to go steal this one little ewe lamb from this poor man down the street and take that in and have it slaughtered for sacrifice. And David gasps in horror. Who could do such a thing? And Nathan says, well, what should we do about it? And David says, string him up. How could he? He deserves to die. And if you remember, Nathan looks at David and says, you are the man. And then David realized his sin, and that's what he had done to the wife of Uriah. It's a really powerful story. And it ends with Psalm 51, David repenting for his sin. Now, David and Bathsheba, one-on-one, had probably talked about all of this. But it wasn't enough. So it went to stage 2. And before all of Israel had to know about it, which eventually they would through David's psalm and the story in the history book, but before everybody else had to be involved, all it took was Nathan, one good and true friend, one man to keep the king accountable, one man who had the guts to tell his friend that he had done wrong, that he needed to fix it. And then the story ended much better than it would have otherwise. I don't think there are any happy endings that involve sin, but I think there are constructive endings. I think eventually sin can be eradicated, and then the happy ending can come, the happily ever after. But in the meantime, we have to fight against sin. We have to pull the weeds. Nathan was willing to pull the weeds with David. I wonder in your life if anyone's been willing to do that. I wonder if you, like Nathan, could do that for the people you care about. I bet you have some real life examples. But even if you don't, the best thing to do with a sermon like this is to make some examples. It's the holidays. This week, Many of you are going to see family you barely ever see. Some of those family you barely see because you barely want to. And then you'll see them again in a month. I bet there's some conflict there. Drama, unresolved. Do something about it. But I'm going to give you homework. So if you are taking notes, then write this down. If you're not, lock it away up here. If you have residual conflict with anyone, if anyone has sinned against you or you've sinned against anyone, do something about it this week. Make amends. Go to them one-on-one. And in love and with humility and grace, talk to them about it. And if that doesn't go well, bring a mediator. Bring a couple of people that you love and trust, that you know love that person too. And deal with the conflict. Pull the weeds before they choke out all the good and beautiful things around them.